Thank you, and I want to thank Villanova University and Father Ellis, Father Donahue, and especially the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies for hosting this. And I want to thank the scholars that I've come to know and listen to over the last few days. I've learned a lot from your presentations this morning, from Rami, and then from what we heard yesterday. It's been mentioned that several times that Villanova's basketball team is ranked #1. And I've got to mention that again as well, not only because I'm an alumnus, but I checked my calendar. And Father Ellis, the last time I was actually on campus, it was to meet you. And I'm not lying, it was the exact same day that Villanova was ranked #1 on that very same day. Coincidence? I think not. Before I get into my talk, which I think will try to cover a lot of ground and I think will be complementary to, in both senses, to Rami, and hopefully add some more insight, I want to pause and offer a few words expressing my profound respect for the institution here. It's very special for me to come back and see many of the professors and those who worked in university leadership and in other aspects. Villanova's #1 in basketball, but it's also #1 to me in my heart, and every day when I think about how this place expanded my horizons and honed my skills and knowledge, it means a lot to me. And so what you do every day, day in and day out, for those of you still here, it matters a lot. And I know there's a couple of students here, I think. It's perplexing to me to think that I was here a quarter century ago. During a period of geopolitical transition and changes in the Middle East, a different period, I think, where when I was here, the Soviet Union collapsed 25 years ago, the Berlin Wall had fallen, all of the complex turmoil in the Middle East with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait was a much different moment of geopolitical transition and change in the Middle East than what we see right now, but I think it's on the same level and scale. And the skills that this institution provides to students and others are essential to try to have a level-headed clinical analysis of what's going on. And that's what I'm going to try to do today in my presentation, and I'm going to try to cover it shortly because I really am keen and anxious to get to a dialogue on these issues. And what I'm going to try to do is cover 3 topics. One is the impact of, I'll call it the impact of regional power struggles. I know the title says Shia-Sunni political conflict, but I want to present what I hope is a complete picture that nests the sectarian tensions between Shia and Sunni in the broader context. Second, I want to briefly talk about how these struggles have impacted not only Christians, but especially Christians, but other religious minorities, individuals of other faiths, those of who may not have faith. And then third, I want to offer some ideas, going back to where Father Ellis started us and some people asked last night, what could be done? And maybe this is a bridge to some of the conversation we'll have later today. And I should say that these comments are based on research that I've done with colleagues in the region. We did a report last year on the plight of Christians in the Middle East, which I handed out some copies, but if you want any, come to me afterwards. I have a few more. And then we put this out last year on the Christians, and then more recently an analysis on US policy in the Middle East, which we released a couple of weeks ago in October. Lastly, in my opening remarks, I'm going to do my best to avoid what I'm actually paid to do, which is to offer commentary and advice on US foreign policy. I'm actually happy to engage in that in the back and forth, but I want to offer as much of a clinical analysis and then suggestions about what could be done. I might slip into sort of that mode of what can be done when I talk about the US government a little bit later, but happy to talk about some of the questions about how the US engages in the region. So first, the first overall topic, the impact of the regional struggle and a snapshot of the Middle East today. I think Rami captured it, but in essence, what we see in the Middle East today is an intense competition for power and influence between and within the states of the region, and increasingly assertive non-state or sub-state actors. Yes, the Shia-Sunni or Iran-Saudi Arabia competition is one feature of it, but it's only one feature. It's an important feature, but there are multiple layers of it. And in this snapshot, I'd stress 4 points. One, this competition for power and influence is multipolar. Again, it's not just Iran and Saudi Arabia. Debates among Gulf Cooperation Council countries over the last couple of years of the status of political Islam have had a profound impact on the situation in places like Libya or Egypt. And it continues, I think, to have an impact on the status of persecuted minorities and Christians. And quite clearly, I'm not denying that Shia-Sunni sectarian tensions aren't a feature. If you see what happened in January of this year, after Saudi Arabia executed a number of individuals, including Nimr al-Nimr, a prominent Shia cleric, this sparked a lot of the tensions that existed there and had reverberations throughout the region, in Lebanon and in many other places. And just a few months ago, if you look at the comments of Saudi Arabia's Grand Mufti, saying essentially that Shia are not Muslim and that these people are our enemies, there is a sectarian tinge that is part of it. But my main point here is that that's not only it. This competition is largely about power. It takes place to a great extent at the nation state level. And it increasingly has the active engagement of non-state actors, not only Daesh, but sub-state actors that have punched far above their weight. And as a consequence of this battle, some of these sectarian battle lines that are the main event have hardened throughout the Middle East and have become part of the political debate and dialogue, as we heard a lot yesterday from our colleagues. So multiple lines of tension, Iran versus Saudi Arabia, Shia versus Sunni, one of many. But in this structural environment, I would say on the first point is that it's, again, stressing multipolar. My assessment is that none of the actors will likely appear as a hegemon. So from time to time, you often hear, in the wake of the Iran nuclear deal or other things, wishful thinking about a new equilibrium, or perhaps Iran now will dominate. I think structurally, when you look at all of the actors and the multiplicity of them, I think what we see is a multipolar and very complex environment. The second point I'd say about this snapshot is that this competition for power and influence is multidimensional. It takes place in multiple arenas. The things that we read about in the news every day, the conflict in Syria, what's going on in Yemen, is front and center in the minds of many analysts, but it's not the only arena. It's not just what is happening militarily, which I think is devastating to the state system, as Rami indicated and others have. It is taking place in other arenas, in politics, in the media, in the economy, and who is investing in whom within the region. It's intra-regional. And many of you may remember Malcolm Kerr and some of his scholarship on the Arab Cold War that took place in the broader Cold War. What I think is happening right now is a new Arab Cold War, a struggle for influence that is taking place not only on the battlefield through proxies and active support of different proxies, but this new feature, I think, has been the expansion of the use of media tools of multiple actors within the region, investment in politics, interference in politics. You can see this in places like Egypt, Iraq, or other places. And in general, in such a, I think, fragmented picture, it's hard to talk about general trends, but generally, the wealthier, more politically stable, more internally stable or coherent ideologically states have sought to advance their national interests by offering support to governments or political actors in the countries that are less wealthy and gripped by deep political polarization. That's not to suggest that Iran or Saudi Arabia are inherently stable in and of themselves, but the main point is that this investment in multiple tools mostly comes from those wealthier actors, and it's playing out in a broader scene, and it's not just military. It's media campaigns being used as a force multiplier to frame debates. There's a fierce contest for identity politics, which directly impacts the topic that we're concerned with, the status of Christians, other religious minorities, the basic dignity and basic citizenship of individuals. Third, and again, a lot of overlap, why is this taking place in this context? This is largely the result of a crisis of political legitimacy that did not appear overnight. A crisis in many of the states, a crisis of political legitimacy defined, again, I think political scientists, and I was a historian here, have a debate about political legitimacy, but in essence, the internal support for the system of government expressed by the people. This is a crisis of political legitimacy decades in the making. Scholars from within the region identified some of the challenges in the Arab Human Development Report 15 years ago, before the Freedom Agenda was a gleam in anyone's eye in a US administration. And I think the erosion of social contracts, the old deal that governments have had with their populations, has substantially eroded. A big part of this also, crisis of legitimacy, is the lack of open and vibrant debate about the future, which keeps societal discourse stuck in the past and the present, and societal discourse largely on an identity politics, us versus them, as opposed to specific debates about solving countries' problems. And again, trying to paint this with a broad brush, but it varies from country to country. But the specific problems, I think, of political legitimacy and broader issues of terrorism are linked to this lack of a clear political alternative to this extremist ideologies expressed and espoused by a range of groups. And lastly, just in this snapshot, and I don't want to go on forever, the actions of the countries in the region, this new assertiveness in this new Arab Cold War, to reinforce what Rami has stated, has contributed to state fragmentation and state collapse. I would add to that the Middle East, when you compare it to other parts of the world, Europe, Asia, Latin America, lacks an overall comprehensive regional architecture, security architecture, political architecture, to govern and moderate some of the regional competition. There are security structures that exist, but they're only modest. They're not very integrated. The regional states often cooperate more closely with outside forces like the United States, and have a dependency which I think trends towards dysfunctional and unhelpful for the long haul. But the lack of a comprehensive structure actually leaves the regional structure much more vulnerable to the forces of sectarianism, to the forces of strong, I think, xenophobic nationalism, and a lack of cooperation. So to sum up, I mean, I think the Iran and Saudi Arabia, Shia versus Sunni element of it is very important. It's a key part of it, but it's not the only part of it. The fundamental gap is what I think a lot of us have been talking about on many of the panels: a lack of a coherent sense of inclusive and pluralistic citizenship in many countries. And I would say, as an American as well, it's something that all societies, including societies like ours, struggle with, and quite vividly, I think, in most recent years. Which leads me to the second part of the topic, which is to the core of the challenge facing Christians and other religious minorities. And here again, I want to note, I'm going to talk mostly about Christians because we did a research on it, but I want to acknowledge that I think a pluralistic approach to engaging on these questions needs to take into account all of the people of different faiths, or those who actually don't have faith. And in the Middle East, I mean, quite clearly, some of the oldest Christian communities in the world are disappearing in the lands where their faith was born and took root. This cauldron, this sort of complex security environment and political environment has not been kind to people of many different backgrounds. And I think the impact of the regional competition that I stressed, along with some of the engagements from outsiders like the United States and Russia, has actually exacerbated the situation. But the main point I want to stress, and we stressed in our report, is that the impact of all of this on Christian populations varies quite a lot from country to country. When you take a look at it, and what we did is we went to nearly every country in the region where there was a meaningful Christian presence, except Syria. We weren't able to go inside, but we talked to Syrians on the border. And I was talking to some of the other scholars last night about all of the historical factors that have contributed to migration. But we're in a particularly intense period where the waves of forced migration over the past decade, combined with some historical trends over previous decades, over the past century, have essentially led to a decline in the Christian presence in many places. To be clear, and again, I want to try to avoid commenting on US policy, the 2003 Iraq War contributed to this. I went into Iraq with an NGO after the war, which I was against, and the devastating impact it had on Christians, Yazidis, and other religious communities, I think, have been catastrophic. And most of what is happening, though, to Christians in the Middle East is the result of some of these wider regional trends, the struggle for power, and then the absence of a coherent support and popular support for this notion of citizenship. So in this context, individuals of all walks of life have become vulnerable as respect for basic freedoms has deteriorated across the board, and Christians themselves have been defenseless and particularly exposed in places like Iraq and Syria. But it's, I think, important to note, I used to live in Palestine, in the West Bank, and Gaza in the 1990s, and when you talk to Christians, and I know we have some Christians from Palestine here, is that a lot of the strains and problems that they face as Christians are the same problems and strains that Palestinians face from the occupation day in and day out. If you have a chance to look at the report, but basically we go through each of the countries and try to articulate this nuanced, no one-size-fits-all approach. The dynamics have been quite different. But I would try to, in this talk, just sum up there are three categories for the purposes of our conversation today and then later, hopefully this afternoon. One of those crisis categories, the situation in meltdown for Christian communities. And I think Elizabeth may talk a little bit about what has happened to communities like the Christian community in Turkey. In essence, I fear will become the future for Christian communities in Iraq and in Syria. And quite clearly, the Shia-Sunni sectarian struggles, the broader power struggle I talked about, has been especially brutal for Christian communities. What's interesting in the research, and we did the field research in 2013 and 14 for this paper, when you go to these places and you talk to the communities in Iraq, there is a diversity of opinion amongst leaders and lay people in these communities about what needs to be done, what should happen. And when you see some of the debates and proposals that are sometimes put into legislation in Washington about the creation of a Christian province in northern Iraq, what I would say to that is that there are multiple views amongst the Iraqi Christians that at least we interviewed, that there isn't one singular voice, and that when you look at, and I have my own personal views as an analyst on this of how to respond to this, but generally, I think the right framework is to think about how you can revive this notion of citizenship, as far-flung and sort of far afield that may seem in places like Iraq. In Syria, again, there's diversity in the community, but more or less, I think there's an inclination towards trying to cleave one's fortunes to the powers that be. Again, I think the church leadership and others in these meltdown societies do the best that they can, and it's hard to find, I think, the right approach when people are murdering each other at such a great rate. So the first category, the meltdown. And to the extent that when we brainstorm, even if it's small things that we can do to help people who have been made refugees, who are living lives of desperation, and we've seen this in our own research, to help those people who, in some cases, are in the second category, those who have become refugees in Lebanon, in Jordan. The Gulf actually has a large number of Christians from different parts of the Middle East. But when we were doing research for this in Amman, we went to a church in eastern Amman and expecting to interview just the church leader and the priest and others, a handful of people, about what they're doing. And we ended up doing a town hall with about 70 people from Syria and some from Iraq. And the desperation of all walks of life and the lack of enough resources. And those of you from Lebanon or others see this, I think, day in and day out. And this is not to suggest that the UN or other aid agencies aren't doing their job. It's just to suggest that the magnitude of the crisis, how quickly things are moving, even today as we sit here, what is happening in Aleppo, and what's sort of waves of migration that's producing. It's hard for the system to catch up, and I think for certain religious groups, including Christians in the Middle East, there may be a discomfort about going into a camp or an aid, getting aid in the way that some others from those communities go. And then, so the first category is the crisis. The second is places where people are going, Christians and others, to avoid those crises. And then the third, which I think we need to recognize, are places like Egypt, where there's a stronger degree of stability in the system today. And I've spent a lot of time in Egypt, spent much of my summer in Egypt, talking to everybody from President Sisi on down about the complex situation there. And more or less, I think if you talk to many Coptic Christians and Christians in Egypt, they feel slightly reassured about the current arrangement relative to what existed before. But delve in a little bit deeper, and there's still concerns about longstanding institutional, legalized, discriminatory practices about church building, about us versus them mindset. I mean, the nationalism in Egypt is still quite strong, but the Christian-Muslim tensions have always lurked beneath the surface. And I think some in Egypt describe to us, this somewhat Faustian bargain that church leadership has made with President Sisi, who is authoritarian and autocratic, but relative to what they had before, they feel slightly more reassured. But the main point is that the legal institutional frameworks that existed for a long time that don't treat everybody as equal citizens, that don't respect basic freedoms of everyone, including Christians in Egypt, are not as strong as they could be. So to round out, on the second section, is that it's a complicated picture. There's no one-size-fits-all. Christians in Palestine or other religious minorities in Palestine face a different dynamic, certainly, than what Iraqi Christians and Syrians are facing. Egypt has a different situation, but don't be reassured that it seems stable. It may seem temporarily stable right now, but there are certain longstanding institutional practices that remain on the books. And the last thing I'd say is, and this edges a little bit towards U.S. engagement on it and U.S. official engagement on it, but one of the more interesting things that came up in the field research for this paper, and again, we did this before Russia's intervention in Syria, but there was a very strong sense among many of the Christian leaders that we interviewed for this research that Russia had voiced greater concern about Christians and religious minorities than the United States. And maybe you always have to try to discount that as a researcher who comes from America and who speaks Arabic, but maybe they're trying to make a special point. But it seems, if you look at how President Putin and others articulate the challenges that they face in terms of geopolitics, the use of sort of Christianity comes up a little bit more. And that's not to suggest that I think the U.S. should fight fire with fire in any means, but I think it's an important point when we talk about what needs to be done. And that's what I want to close with, and hopefully I think I'm going a little under because I want to have more time for dialogue. If there's one overall point, and I hope you capture it, is that it's what's going on in the region right now has a lot of complexity and a lot of nuance. So our engagement on this simply won't fit with a one-size-fits-all approach. I think Rami's correct that equal citizenship should be the ideal goal. How you get there matters it's quite different from country to country. It depends on the political context, and I could imagine in a place certainly like Tunisia, where there are far fewer, I think, Christian minorities or other religious minorities, but there are differences of views, you can see that model sort of being open to facilitating that. In Egypt, perhaps, there's institutions that have reach in their communities, Christian and Islamic. The current path, I don't think Egypt is on, opens itself to a sustainable respect for equal citizens. I think it offers some limited protections for the short period, but in terms of what can be done, I'd just suggest 5 things. And number one, this sort of, just listening to the speakers yesterday, and hopefully we'll talk about this. Number one, as an outsider who has lived in the region for several years, I go there at least once or twice a month. I'm going back to the region next week for a few days. Outsiders have to approach this with a great deal of humility, that the struggle is first and foremost in the region. And I think it centers largely around how do the intellectual leaders, some of you who are amongst them, how do the political leaders, how do faith leaders actually try to forge a different discourse and a different identity that centers around pluralism and inclusion? And I think our session later this morning, early this afternoon, can talk about this. The political debate, how do you have a political debate that's not based on religious or ethnic ideas, but a battle of ideas? And I say that as an American who just has witnessed our own political campaign, which continues. where there's been a rise of us versus them identity politics in established democracies, where there aren't really have been textured sort of policy discussions here. So I say it with humility, but that a lot of what I've experienced and seen in the Middle East, I think in some ways has been echoed and reverbed back in Europe and in some of the established democracies. The second, and I hope this is not too meager, is that we all need to bear witness and acknowledge the tragedy that communities like Christians in the Middle East and then others are facing. And this is something, again, as a policy analyst, I feel like is not part of our debate. And I think General Zinni talked a bit about the responsibility to protect, which in the US context, I think sometimes conjures up, notions of liberal interventionism and sort of US military intervention. And that's not what I'm talking about when I say bear witness and recognize it. It's just not in our consciousness as much. When I go out to college campuses or speak about the personal human tragedy that you see playing every day. And I don't know what it is. It's something about the ADD, attention deficit disorder nature of our media and of our national consciousness. But you can see a poor boy, his body washed up on a beach last year, and people will talk about it for 12 hours, and there'll be some media coverage, and then it'll circle back to it. And I know we have 3 more minutes and I'm about to close. But bearing witness, I think, means even in individual ways, and that's what we were trying to do in this report on the plight of Christians in the Middle East, is to try to re-inject the sense of insani, of being humane, that it's not just about geopolitics where I started, and connecting with the people of the region. Third, talk about what we can do to preserve human life and advance the common good, and even if it is in a small way, to help respond to the humanitarian crisis. When we were doing this research, we're in Madaba in Jordan, south of Amman, and we ran into a school, a Greek Orthodox school, where they were trying to educate more people who were coming from Syria. And we were able to suggest some private donors who might support funding for it in a small way. I think people do this already. There may be bigger ways to do this, to help people. And I know this may sound small given the magnitude of the crisis, but if we all did something in a smaller way to do this and help individuals and remind everybody that this is part of who we are as a humanity, I think it's very important. Fourth, and this is where maybe Villanova University and other academic institutions in the region, Bethlehem University, co-sponsoring this, what can be done to preserve the heritage of different communities like Christian communities and others? And what I see happening, and we've talked to people in Erbil and in northern Iraq, where there really is a crisis of these maniacs destroying artifacts, books. It's part of our human heritage. And maybe I'm missing it, but I don't see a concerted effort on the part of the UN, UNESCO, or others. I may be missing it, but I don't see enough attention from religious communities and things like that to talk about these issues. And then fifth and lastly, I said I'd stay away from US policy, but I just want to frame it as I think the US actually does have a major impact on the region, for better and for worse at times, and I can reserve my comments on what I think may happen with the transition of administration if anyone's interested in it. I have views on it. I think it's still quite unclear, but the main point I'd say is that the US has more leverage than I think many policymakers in Washington assume that we have. And it's not just military leverage. I want to recognize and respect the fact that our military leverage is important, and it's a factor. I think it can be used in better ways, has been used in good ways to produce some positive outcomes, but by and large, it's been incomplete because it's not been wrapped up in a broader strategic framework of what does US engagement mean that includes all of these issues of how does how do our diplomats engage, but what do our humanitarian organizations do? There isn't, I think, when you talk to friends in the region, there really is a less clear sense of what the US is all about in its foreign policy, and I've written about this for several years, that there has been a crisis of purpose about the US engagement in the Middle East, and I think that may continue. So to conclude on the topic, is that the fate of Christians, I think, in the Middle East is directly linked to broader historical, political, and cultural trends in the region. What we see in the last decade is part of a steady decline over the past century in which the overall presence of Christians in key parts of the region has declined. This past decade plus of strife has led millions more Christians to be uprooted from their homes. and that the United States, by and large, I think, has been a bystander to many of these trends, except in some cases, like I mentioned, the Iraq War, or some actions where we have not enhanced the stability. I want to recognize that. And we've not done enough. But I think the sort of thing in the conversation I'd like to open up, and I know we'll continue our panel with Elizabeth, and she'll have great insights, is what we can do either at a national level to engage with partners in the region, or individually, or as institutionally. I think there's actually a lot more space and room, even if it seems small. Some small contributions could actually have major positive externalities, whether it's heritage protection or the protection of dignity of individuals, and even if it only affects a family. I think those things could be profound and have major impacts in our own discourse about the region and how the region talks about itself. So thank you very much.